I want to step back and look at the larger context of what is afoot here in Silicon Valley. Our age today, in my opinion, is defined by a race between exponentials. They're the positive exponentials we're very familiar with because we actually spun them right out of here in Silicon Valley. Things like Moore's Law, I certainly don't need to explain it to this room, but we know what the implications of it has been, and it's been very good to this place. So next time you're stuck in traffic on Highway 280, thank Gordon Moore and Intel. But other exponential opportunities that have come out of that, solar photovoltaics, that in the 1960s people talked about energy, too cheap to be metered. They were talking about nuclear power. We're getting it with solar photovoltaics, again, because of the exponential function of the technologies that we've invented. And it's not just in that space. This is the Carlson curve, which is the curve showing the cost of decoding the human genome. It's actually advancing faster than Moore's Law. So we're surrounded by this vast cluster of positive exponentials, changing our lives for the better, though my iPhone still starts too slowly. Note that Apple, iPhone X has only got 6 billion transistors in it. It's not quite enough. Those are the exponentials we know. There's a whole other set of exponentials, and those are the exponential challenges we're facing. Things like climate change. This is 10,000 years of data on carbon dioxide partial pressures in our atmosphere, and you notice that little vertical line way off to the right. This is not a startup business plan. This is what's happening with carbon dioxide. It's an exponential function, and quite obviously, it's not sustainable. And another exponential function is global population. Also, this goes back to 10,000 BC, so 12,000 years of data. Again, we're way off in the right at the top. Also an exponential that's not sustainable. So this is truly a moment where we're in a race between two kinds of exponentials. The exponential challenges like this and the exponential opportunities presented by the innovations we create here in Silicon Valley. And we think we're doing a great job using the exponential opportunities to meet the exponential challenges. We have grand challenges everywhere. It's reached the point where kindergarten classes in Silicon Valley, write up their annual impact statement, and we have all sorts of wonderful things going on. I'm here to note a word of caution. It feels like we're accelerating and we're meeting the challenges, but maybe things are not exactly like they seem. So let me take you back to September 2016. Y'all remember the Loma Fire. And thanks to Amazon overworking UPS drivers, we managed to have a picture captured of this fire moments after it started by Carlos Conche of UPS. And the smoke is coming up the hill, and that little dot down there is a helicopter. Not just any old helicopter, that is a CDF copter. And so the fire department was literally hovering overhead when this fire started. By the way, this was caused by another high-growth industry, not involving semiconductors. So it was a pot grow, and actually they're not so bad. I compare them to Silicon Valley. There are only two high-growth industries I know on the planet that refer to their customers with the term user. And you laugh, but those folks have an advantage over Silicon Valley because A, their product actually works as advertised, and B, last time I checked, the first hit's free. And when did you ever get anything free from? Anyway, I diverge. So the fire department is literally hovering overhead when this fire starts, and you go, great, they're going to get this thing out because fire trucks are rolling, lights are flashing, vehicles are accelerating, and of course they put it out the same day. Of course not. It burned until October 8th. 15 days, almost 5,000 acres, 26 structures burned, almost 400 fire personnel in 26 agencies. What's the problem? The problem is it was a race between two exponentials, or between a non-exponential and exponential. Fire trucks accelerate linearly. Fire grows exponentially. So that burning fire growing exponentially is just like the exponential challenges we're facing all over the planet today. And the fire trucks were rolling and the lights were flashing, and everybody said, as we're speeding down the freeway, we're gaining on the fire. In fact, even as the fire trucks were accelerating and the equipment was rolling out, we were falling further and further behind. That is a challenge on the planet today. It's also the challenge here with the local challenges in Silicon Valley. And we all bear a special responsibility because the technology innovations we delivered are contributing to the exponential challenges, not just offering solutions. As Heraclitus put so nicely nearly 2,000 years ago, nothing new comes into our lives without a hidden curse. And the more powerful the thing that arrives in our life, the more subtle the hidden curse is, and thus the greater the responsibility to the innovator to help solve the problem. So I want to use the rest of my time to offer you a framework for thinking about the challenges, the exponential challenges we're facing, not just here in the Valley, but globally. It's a pace layer diagram. This is my good friend Stuart Brand developed this in 1999, borrowing from what's called shear layers in architecture. The way to think about this is everything that exists around us exists because of an intersection of fast and slow processes. Fashion moves fastest, nature moves most slowly. Think about this room. The thing that changes most often is who's sitting in chairs. That changes about 45 minutes, go out, get a break, come back. A little more slowly is the arrangement of the furniture, probably half a day in this case. Slower than that, the paint on the walls, slower yet, the building itself, and of course the slowest thing is the property lines. This same thing is true at a civilizational level. Fashion moves unpredictably and quickly. Commerce is a little slower and more predictable. Infrastructure, that takes, 50 to 100 years. Governance, we haven't had a revolution in this country for about 150 years. Who knows? Maybe we're overdue. And culture, slowest of all, and then nature. Innovations and fast-moving things often occur because of underlying forces that we don't notice. Go back to 1969, Neil Armstrong walks on the moon. We also, by coincidence, get the 4004 in the same period, except it was not a coincidence. The way to think about it was conflicts at a lower level. We had this culture and governance conflict called the Cold War. We will bury you, Borshki, Khrushchev said. And after fighting 2 global wars, our leaders were smart enough to say, how about a proxy symbolic competition instead of a real war? Kennedy announces the race to the moon, and he comes back and he says to his scientists, said, of course you can do that. And they said, yes, sir. And he walks out of the room, and they look at each other and go, well, that's computational unobtainium. We can't put vacuum tubes in rockets. We need solid state electronics. And they were absolutely desperate for it. And the result was a couple of geeks in Silicon Valley got the mother of all early adopters. We all know an early adopter is someone who pays too much money for something that doesn't quite work. NASA and the Air Force were very happy to overpay, and it poured money into the semiconductor industry. We probably got the microprocessor at least a decade earlier than we otherwise would have. So what you see is constructive conflict at lower layers bubbles up into infrastructure and commerce and yields a good result. And I emphasize, it's not the layers that matter so much as the boundaries between 2 layers. Let me give you a picture of where we are, thanks to NASA. This is a picture of Jupiter, the mid-equatorial bands, and you see those lovely whorls, and of course there's the great red spot. turbulent boundaries between layers are the productive zones. It's commerce and infrastructure bumping up against each other. It's commerce and governance bumping up against each other, and we've seen that. Now, I used to serve, at one point I served with the Air Force Science Board, so I'm required to tell you. I'm also teach on the faculty engineering school at Stanford. No equations, but I'm required to tell you that little whorl is what's known as a velocity shear, a Kelvin-Helmholtz instability. Just think about it next time you pour some milk in your coffee. Those little turbulences are exactly the same as the creative space that we are here in Silicon Valley, intersection of long and short-term government and innovation and the like. Ordinary order is the top moves fast and the bottom moves slowly, except when it doesn't. When things move more quickly at a lower level, that's when we have revolutions and that's when we have change. Go back to 1906, San Andreas Fault, which we barely knew existed. We had the 1906 quake, big impact on infrastructure, and of course we know what happened, the great earthquake and fire of San Francisco. However, when something bubbles up from the bottom, it inevitably starts ping-ponging around through the other layers, and this is what adds unpredictability. The 1906 quake led to the panic of 1907. The global panic of 1907 happened because San Francisco had had a big fire about 10 years before 1906. And they'd learned their lesson. They put in water cisterns. They had the best fire department, one of the best fire departments on the planet. And all the insurers noticed that they'd learned their lesson. And a whole bunch of insurers, particularly in England, were way long on fire insurance in San Francisco. And as we know, the earthquake caused vast destruction in San Francisco. The job was finished by the Army. General Funston had the brilliant idea of using Van Ness Avenue as a fire break, and so he ordered his soldiers to dynamite down Van Ness, and the result was that threw all the embers over into the side of the city that didn't burn. So the result was we had lots of fire claims. And at the time, we had no central bank, and we were on the gold standard. And that meant that the insurers, to pay these things out, had to draw on gold at the Bank of England. And after a while, the bank said, wait a second, the gold's supposed to go from California to England, not vice versa. That's how it worked 50 years before. And so they turned off the spigot. It led to a liquidity crisis, and we thus had the panic of 1907. But it doesn't even stop there, because after the panic of 1907, everybody said, maybe we need a central bank. We still don't quite have one, but the Central Reserve Act of 1913 is a direct consequence of the financial panic that came from the San Francisco quake. So think about the interactions of those layers. They can be positive, like the space program leading to the semiconductor technology. Sometimes they can be negative. And by the way, speaking about earthquakes, how many people noticed this news 2 Sundays ago in Hayward? Water main break out of nowhere. I'm actually responsible for part of this story because I know that street. I've been on that street before, taking a picture of a curbing that was offset by 3 inches. And I went, of course. That water main broke because it was directly on top of the Hayward Fault. There's the water main break, there's the offset curb. You know, the Hayward Fault was just reminding us that it may be sleeping, but it is still stirring in its sleep, and it's way overdue. And Joint Venture Silicon Valley is working on a joint project with the USGS, and we have all sorts of preparations. But this is a classic case of an exponential phenomena. We are absolutely not prepared for the Hayward earthquake. And when it happens, the economic impact on the United States will be equal to the economic impact of the US Civil War in the 1860s, except it will happen in 20 seconds. Think about how quickly our fire trucks can respond to that. Or to summarize it, Will and Ariel Durant in the 1950s put it nicely: civilization exists by geologic consent, subject to change without notice. So I want to go back to the pace layers. And you can think of innovation as a conversation across these layers. That, think about, so who here is in government? Raise your hand. Imagine you were dropped into New York and you had to have a long conversation with a fashion designer about planning a meeting. Would you even know what the language was? And of course, we always have these complaints about people in business not understanding government. The reason is because each unit has a different concept of time. The fashion world, it's, a couple of months, maybe a couple of weeks. Talk to a geologist and they'll talk to you in millions of years. Everybody else is in between. Each layer has its own function. Fast layers versus slow layers. Fast layers learn. Slow layers remember. Fast layers propose. Think of fashion. Those of you who remember in the 1980s, we were told by fashion that double knit trousers and leisure suits were cool. Well, and luckily slow layers dispose. We said, that's a very bad idea along with photo-gray lenses. Let's not do that again. Fast layers absorb shocks. Slow layers integrate shocks. Think about the earthquake example. The fast layer are the fire trucks responding quickly. The slow layers are the urban planners saying we need to have higher seismic standards. Fast layers tend to be discontinuous. Slow layers tend to be continuous. Except, of course, when they move quickly, like nature with an earthquake. Fast layers innovate, slow layers constrain. Think about the history of Silicon Valley as a conversation between these two layers. Also, think about which layer do you live in? What is your natural language of talking about things? Silicon Valley, we are masters of the fast. But are we in pursuing the fast? And we've gotten faster and faster than ever. It used to be fast in the 60s with microprocessors. Then we get into the personal computer era. And remember the first computer that wasn't putty colored? How many decades did it take us to realize, or more specifically, thank God for Steve Jobs, who so boldly said computers can come in colors other than gray. But now we've reached the point where our technology is fashion. It's moving super quickly. You don't replace your smartphone because it's obsolete. You replace it because the fashion is to have a slightly faster screen. Similarly, social media, we're moving way up into the fashion layer. We're responding to people and the like. Are we neglecting the slow? Is the secret to Silicon Valley's future to pay a little bit of attention to those slower layers and also to think back to our history of the folks who looked at those slow layers? Recall Messrs. Hewlett and Packard starting in a garage. They weren't looking for a 3.5-year turnaround on their investment. They were looking to build a very long-term entity. Fred Terman, who went to the president of Stanford to establish Stanford Industrial Park, he was not thinking on a 3-year time frame. He was thinking on a decadal time frame. Artificial intelligence, you just heard from my colleague Jure, 1956, John McCarthy started that whole era. It's taken us decades to get to this point of fast change. And we're just coming up on the 50th anniversary of Doug Engelbart's famous demo in San Francisco. People worked for decades on slow things with long time frames to get us to a place where we could act quickly and respond quickly. If we want to be fast, if we want to continue to innovate and innovate quickly, we have to tend to the slow. And we have to become better at tending to the slow. Think about the road from Tim Berners-Lee's famous memo in 1989, supported by government research, in this case, England. And one of my favorite examples of the slow is Charles Keeling, the father of the Keeling curve measuring atmospheric carbon. This was, I had to bring in my slides 2 days ago, so it's a little out of date, but this is the data from February 4th. Charles Keeling leveraged a technology innovation. He was really fascinated with gas manometers, and there was a newfangled gas manometer that he managed to develop down at Caltech. The first measurement occurred here in Northern California in Big Sur. And think about someone dedicating their life to slow, patient measurement. The result is the Keeling curve. The climate change debate in this country is a difficult debate because we seem, at least in Washington, to have infinite capacity to turn everything into a political debate. But imagine how much harder this debate would be if we did not have the benefit of the Keeling curve. So we need to pay attention to the slow. And by the way, being a member of the faculty at an academic institution here in Silicon Valley, one of the biggest problems we have in this country today is the continued erosion of science, research, and development. We are literally throwing away the seed corn that will be the foundation of building Silicon Valley 20, 30, 40 years from now. So everybody who's done well by Moore's Law should be sure to spend a little bit of time trying to find a way to help protect our university research efforts. So my closing message is this. Do not abandon speed. We have to move quickly here in Silicon Valley. And we all know the joke. Sleep, you can sleep when you die. We got work to do here. But leave some time for the long view. Tend to the long, because that is Silicon Valley's insurance policy. This place has survived as long as it has because we had deep, deep foundations. And we were willing to move quickly and willing not to walk away from long-term things, even when we weren't thinking about it. And I want to close with a story. It's a story first told by Gregory Bateson in the mid-1960s about New College at Oxford. Of course, like so many things in England, they have problems with truth in advertising. New College, in fact, is not new. It was founded in 1379. But if you walk down Jowett Walk, you'll come on New College, and one of the first things you will see is the main hall at New College, which at Oxford colleges, there's great pride in their buildings, and their great hall is one of the oldest structures at New College. And it's a huge structure. It's, probably almost as long as this, well, about 2/3 the length of this room. And in the ceiling are these beautiful heritage oak beams, just gigantic beams, almost as wide as your table. About 100 years ago, the Dons were at high table and they noticed there was more than the usual amount of dust sifting down from the ceiling. And even though they were fuzzy-muzzy academics, they realized that might be an issue. So they brought in a building surveyor, what the English call building inspectors, and he went up and he looked up there and he poked around and he came back down. He was, see them beams up there? They's dry rot. They's gone to beetles. Everybody knows oaks go to beetles. You can stick your finger in them, you're going to have to replace them. This was 100 years ago before Home Depot and Paralam, and they thought, where in the heck are we going to find beams to replace those beams? And they were thrashing around trying to figure it out, and eventually word of the predicament worked its way out to the head of the college lands, because every college at Oxbridge has its lands, except the college I happened to go to. We didn't have a lot of land, but we had a great wine cellar. And so the college forester comes into the master's office, and he said, well, sir, your oaks are ready. And the master says, my oaks? He says, yeah, way back 500 years ago when this building was built, your predecessor's ex-predecessor was talking to my predecessor's ex-ex-ex predecessor, and they had just cut down the beams for the great hall, and they looked at each other and said, they're going to have to replace those beams someday, because everybody knows oaks goes to beetles. And so my predecessor 500 years ago planted a forest of oak trees. And he said to his successor, don't cut down them's oaks. They's needed for the great hall. And that was passed on to every successive forester. Your oaks are ready. So the question I would ask at this moment is, what are the overlooked oaks that not only underpin Silicon Valley, but that we need to carefully maintain and care for, lest they be needed a generation or two from now? My advice is this. Pay attention to the fast. Pay attention to what you're doing every day. But take some percentage of your time 3%, 5%, 1%, it doesn't matter. But take some percent of your time to plant some acorns that will grow into oak trees, the shade of which you will never sit under, but your children and your great-grandchildren and the executives sitting in this room 60 years from now will thank you for doing so. Thank you.